Teníamos muchísimas ganas en la Marea de hablar con expertos y expertas en extrema derecha y hoy hemos decidido que queríamos invitar a esta conversación a una persona que la conoce bien, una persona que se llama Morgan Finnsiö y él es residente en Suecia y trabaja para una de las revistas pioneras en el análisis, la investigación y la denuncia de la extrema derecha. Expo es un proyecto muy ambicioso que también tiene una fundación y que tiene además un trabajo de investigación periodístico excepcional durante estas últimas décadas. Una revista que fue además fundada por una persona muy reconocida, tanto a nivel periodístico como a nivel literario, como fue el gran Stieg Larsson, y que además contribuyó mucho también al análisis y la monitorización de la extrema derecha cuando poca gente le prestaba atención en Europa y más allá. Así que presentamos a Morgan Finnsiö y a Patricia Simón y nos gustaría que Morgan nos explicara un poco en qué consiste Expo y en qué consiste su trabajo en esta revista y en las investigaciones que se están llevando a cabo.
Buenas tardes. Thank you very much for the invitation. So my name is Morgan Finnsiö, and I am a journalist and researcher at the Expo Foundation and the Expo magazine, which we publish 4 times per year. Expo was founded in 1995 in Sweden by Stieg Larsson and other journalists as a response to very aggressive and quickly expanding right-wing extremist movement in Sweden at the time. In the middle of the 90s, we had the so-called third wave of fascist organizing in Sweden, and we had a new generation of young people who were radicalized as part of the so-called skinhead movement, inspired by British white power music, by American white supremacy, and by domestic traditions and influences as well in the Swedish right-wing extremist scene. And at this time in the 90s, as I said, this movement was very aggressive. Representatives of this movement carried out a number of violent attacks on people in the streets, some organized attacks, some spontaneous attacks, and several people were killed. A young teenager was tortured to death by neo-Nazis. A young asylum seeker was stabbed to death randomly. There were attacks on trade unionists and leftists, etc. And this gave rise to a kind of a widespread popular mobilization against racism in Sweden. And Expo Foundation was one of the initiatives that came out of that anti-racist mobilization. And the Expo Foundation's idea has always been to do investigative journalism and to basically create, produce information, create knowledge, spread that knowledge to the Swedish public, because we believe that one of the essential ways to defend democracy is to provide it with knowledge about the antagonists of democracy in order to shield society from it. So since then, Expo has, in different ways, mainly, as I said, by publishing this magazine 4 times a year, been covering the far right through monitoring, research, investigative journalism, and also educational work, going to schools, trade unions, faith communities, churches, civil society groups, and sharing our knowledge about the right-wing extremist threat and the nature of their movement, basically to anyone who wants this information and who needs this information in order to make their communities or their workplaces safer.
Morgan, en España, donde todavía falta una cultura de derechos humanos y democrática, a los periodistas que desarrollamos nuestra tarea con ese enfoque de derechos humanos se nos sigue considerando en algunos círculos más activistas que periodistas. En Suecia, ¿compartís esta situación, esta valoración, o el hecho de que llevéis una larga trayectoria hace que se entienda que no hay periodismo que no defienda los derechos humanos?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's a bit of both, and it depends on who you ask in Sweden. There are different perspectives on this, but overall, I would say that there's there's a robust tradition in the Swedish mainstream press and mainstream journalism of a kind of liberal humanist perspective that human rights must be defended, corruption must be rooted out, etc. And Expo has always been part of that tradition and has always been recognized as being part of that tradition. At the same time, we do have, as it were, a political agenda if anti-racism is considered to be political. And we've always been open about that fact. However, there are strong professional norms in Sweden about the craft of journalism and the ethical guidelines and the professional rules of how to produce good journalism, where we think it's possible to say openly that we have our ideological perspective, we are anti-racists, we are anti-fascists. However, our journalism, the journalism that we produce, is going to be still fair and objective insofar as that's possible to do. Now, the extreme right has always disliked us, obviously, but also always disliked other journalists in bigger papers, in mainstream papers, who investigate the far right, and they've always called us left-wing extremists, even terrorists. Tried to link us to all kinds of crazy things, and that perspective has been recognized as basically a smear from these people who don't want to be the subject of investigative journalism. But over time, of course, as the far right has approached the mainstream and become more popular and strong politically in Sweden, they have managed to make others share that perspective and speak about us in that way as well. So I think that Expo has always been considered, both journalists and activists. And now, if you ask people who sympathize with the far right, which is a larger group than it used to be, just 10 years ago, they will emphasize that part. They will emphasize the fact that we're activists and say that, well, they have an agenda, so nothing that they print, nothing that they say, can be relied upon or can be trusted. So it depends on who you ask. But I think that still I think that we are still more widely seen as, the journalists that we actually are still, even though that's been changing.
Suecia ha servido durante muchos años de ejemplo por sus políticas de asilo, por sus políticas en materia de inmigración, en derechos humanos. Sin embargo, estos últimos años hemos visto cómo el partido de extrema derecha, Demócratas de Suecia, pues se ha convertido en el principal partido de las derechas suecas, y por otra parte que las políticas y los debates sobre migración y asilo están siendo puestos en cuestión, y está tambaleándose de alguna manera esta imagen y este liderazgo que había tenido durante muchos años Suecia en estas materias. ¿Cómo lo estáis viviendo desde Suecia?
So, it's a depressing development for sure. As you say, the other right-wing parties, the center-right or right-leaning parties, have to a great extent accepted the Sweden Democrat agenda when it comes to issues of migration. Not just in an abstract or symbolic sense, but very concretely. The current government that took power after the September elections in Sweden consist of the right-leaning parties in the cabinet, and then outside of the cabinet, their formal collaborative partner, which is the Sweden Democrats, which is this far-right party. And in order for the Sweden Democrats to provide their parliamentary support to enable this new government, they agreed upon a formal policy agenda called the Tide Agreement, after Castle Tide, a castle where this agenda was negotiated. And this policy agenda, this agreement, contains an agenda for investigating issues and producing new legislation and introducing new rules, mostly about migration policy and also about issues of law and order and other policy areas as well, but mostly about migration. And this agenda is very, very strongly influenced by Sweden Democrat positions. And I mean, everyone agrees. If you ask, a right-wing analyst or a left-wing analyst, everyone agrees that this policy is basically a wish list for the Sweden Democrats. They themselves boast that this will be a paradigm shift, a new paradigm when it comes to Swedish migration policy. in terms of, just very briefly, but in terms of making it drastically more difficult to work in Sweden, to migrate here, to get residency permits, to become a citizen, to enjoy social and economic benefits if you're not a citizen. Basically, a large number of ways of limiting freedoms and rights for non-citizens in Sweden, and really designed across the board to make it much less attractive and much more difficult to come here for all kinds of foreigners and for any kind of reason. Now, why has that happened? Well, it's a long-term structural trend in Swedish politics, where this previously very strong consensus that asylum rights are very important, that Sweden should have a generous migration policy, that our welfare state is dependent on migration. That consensus has been eroded in the face of basically a populist turn in Swedish politics, both among politicians, established politicians, but also in the media, in public service broadcasting, but also in the corporate-owned media, where people are just much more. There's been a turn where people are just much more comfortable speaking about migration and immigrants and foreigners in a much more sort of right-wing populist way, linking migration to crime, linking migration to all kinds of social issues, in a way that is really not backed up by the facts, by empirical statistics. But it's a cheap way to score political points. And gradually, more and more parties and politicians started adopting this way of speaking about politics. And it seemed as though, Swedish politicians from the left and from the right just ran out of ideas. And the only thing that people, wanted to talk about was migration all the time. And that, of course, was a gift to the Sweden Democrats, because they own this issue of wanting to be tough on migration. So when everyone starts to think that migration is the source of all problems, then people are going to turn to this party that have been, hating on migrants since they were founded in 1988. So now we have a situation where the Sweden Democrats are the second biggest party in Swedish politics. The biggest party is still the Social Democrats, but they are out of power. And the Sweden Democrats then are the biggest party of the entire political right wing in Sweden, and that gives them a strong normative position as well. They are setting the agenda, both literally and figuratively.
Expo es el gran investigador, la revista de las grandes investigaciones sobre el crecimiento de la ultraderecha en los países escandinavos y en concreto en Suecia. Tiene el archivo más importante de los últimos 20 años sobre cómo funciona la ultraderecha y el terrorismo de ultraderecha. Me gustaría saber cuáles son los hallazgos, las claves más importantes que cree que no son suficientemente conocidas y que nos da pistas sobre cómo se articulan internacionalmente, cuáles son las cooperaciones que tienen entre los diferentes grupos y países y cuál es su objetivo.
Thank you for that question. I think the most important insight that we try to share with people when we do interviews, when we do educational work, and in our magazine, is what you mentioned, that the far right really is linked internationally or even transnationally. I think historically there has been a tendency to misunderstand this movement as basically they are nationalists, in Sweden, or nationalists in Norway or in Spain or in Germany, as though these groups are, very, compartmentalized into different areas, and they have very little in common because they fight for different flags. And historically, of course, nationalists, went to war with each other over issues of borders and things like this. But the contemporary extreme right, and I actually would say that this goes back, if we're talking about the extreme right, the fascist movement, this goes back all the way to the 1920s. It has always been a very transnational movement in the sense that they really share so many features. They share features in terms of ideology and discourse and methods and really goals, even on the international arena. And yes, they are not always, good at cooperating across borders or even inside borders, even in one and the same country. But that doesn't mean that they're not one and the same movement. And if you look at them in whatever country you look at, you're struck by more the similarities than the differences. So this is a very important thing to remember, that we're basically looking at the same movement if we're looking at them in Spain or in Sweden. Of course, there are minor variations, and they are good at adapting, their positions and their discourse to local issues, to current issues that are more or less important in a particular place. But these variations are really, small variations on very strong common themes and common ways of being. So that's one very important key to understand. I think another important key is to realize that they're at the heart of their ideology, at the very core of their ideology, is a violent resistance against the idea of equality. And this takes many kinds of forms and expressions, but it always comes down to that they are anti-egalitarian. They want a hierarchical society. They dislike all kinds of egalitarianism, whether it's between the genders or between ethnicities and cultures or between classes or, really between anything. They want a hierarchical society, and that's at the core of everything they do. And finally, I think it's important to recognize how violent they are. They have a mode of operation where they keep going from violent speech and violent ideas to violent practices, and ultimately to terrorism and mass terrorism, and by extension, finally, to war. That's always been the case with this movement. It's very dangerous in that sense. It's dangerous politically, and it's dangerous physically. So these are some of the things that we try to really focus on being clear to people when we speak about the extreme right.
Recientemente en Alemania se ha desarticulado un grupo presuntamente terrorista que tenía como objetivo dar un golpe de Estado e incluso llegar a secuestrar a algunos parlamentarios. Entre sus listas de objetivos había tanto periodistas como políticos de izquierda y también conservadores. La amenaza del terrorismo de extrema derecha ya lleva años siendo considerada una de las amenazas globales más importantes para la democracia y para los países occidentales, ¿no? Que durante muchos años han estado más pendientes de otros tipos de terrorismo y no, sin embargo, del terrorismo de extrema derecha, como es en el caso de España, ¿no? Que ni siquiera se reconoce que exista esa amenaza terrorista de la extrema derecha, como sí que reconocen agencias internacionales y de seguridad de otros países de nuestro entorno. Este año hemos visto algunos atentados de extrema derecha. También en Suecia habéis tenido casos de violencia de extrema derecha, incluso llegando a ser considerados como casos de terrorismo. Respecto a vuestros análisis y vuestras investigaciones, esta amenaza terrorista de la extrema derecha ¿es real? ¿Hay desconocimiento por parte o desinterés por parte de las autoridades para reconocer esta amenaza real?
Yes, I do think that the far right is a threat to democracy overall, and it's an important threat also to individuals on the physical level and to communities of minorities, at the population level in different countries. As I mentioned before, I really would strongly stress that the extreme right needs to be seen as one movement that has, if you will, not organizationally, but as a movement, have branches in different countries, but they're all part of the same movement. And when we see that this movement is becoming much more violent in places like the United States or elsewhere, that violence, that energy of the movement will also find expression elsewhere. So, since the mid 2010s, and in the past decade, we've seen a very, very sharp escalation of far-right violence in different countries. And this is a wave that I think will continue, because during the pandemic, the far-right, sort of grew together with the conspiracy theory believing movements, which also, radicalized people further. So I think there are a lot of tendencies in the movement that point to this trend of increasing violence will continue. Now, some countries are much better at handling this or recognizing this threat than others. For example, Germany has obviously a lot of big problems with right-wing extremism, including in its uniformed services such as the military and police. But they also have a very proactive counter-terrorism strategy against the far right, a police strategy against the far right, and they are making a lot of arrests. Obviously, they managed to stop this plot that we recently saw with the Reichsbürger movement. And the political leadership is there. I mean, the top political leadership in Germany from both the right and the left have spoken publicly and said this is a priority for our country. We have to smash the far right. Now, there's nothing like that level of political leadership or clarity of purpose in Sweden, for example. Sweden does consider the far right to be a threat. The Swedish security services have, in the past couple of years, upgraded the terror threat to level 3 on a 5-level scale. But so much more needs to be done. And I think that we can look at countries like Germany and the United Kingdom where the authorities are doing more to counteract this threat, and see that perhaps we need to do things like that in countries like Spain and Sweden as well. And then, of course, also civil society and grassroots anti-fascists and ordinary people also have to mobilize against this threat. I think in the United States, we've seen examples after the time of Trump that a lot of ordinary people have sort of woken up to the threat of the far right and started mobilizing in different ways. So it has to happen both on a public level, with agencies and authorities, and people need to demand that type of action from their politicians and from their security services. But it also has to be, on the overall everyday civil society level. But the threat is real, and it comes both from radical right political actors and parties like the Sweden Democrats and the extreme right outside of the parliaments, outside of the formal political institutions. So the threat is on many different levels.
Morgan, has mencionado cómo la ultraderecha, el fascismo, está operando por una parte a través de las instituciones mediante los partidos políticos, y luego están los grupos que operan desde fuera como grupos violentos y terroristas. Por una parte, me gustaría saber si hay conexión entre ellos, cómo se coordinan, si hay estrategias compartidas o si solamente unos ponen el discurso y otros la parte armada. Y también esto, cómo puede verse influido por el hecho de que ya se ha documentado que todas esas armas que se están mandando a Ucrania, hay una parte que están llegando a otros países mediante, pues el mercado negro. Se han encontrado armas en Dinamarca, en Finlandia y en otros países procedentes de esas donaciones, y cómo pueden utilizar esas armas estos grupos de terrorismo de ultraderecha.
So for the first part of the question on the connection between the radical right and the extreme right, the sort of the ones that are taking advantage of the political institutions and then the ones that are outside. It's a complex question. It's difficult to give an easy answer because it can shift from time to time and from situation to situation. On one level, one answer you can give is that if we take Sweden for an example, if you ask the leadership of the Sweden Democrats Party and the leadership of the most extreme extra-parliamentary groups such as the Nordic Resistance Movement, this revolutionary Nazi group, if you ask these two leaderships what they think of each other, they strongly dislike each other, and they will say so openly, and they say that those guys are crazy, we want nothing to do with them. However, if you go down to the level of sympathizers, of low-level members, of people who are interested in the far-right ideology more generally, those people don't have such strong. They don't have these strong borders between groups. They can sympathize with both. They can vote for both. They on the web online. They will you will find them taking part in digital activities around both kinds of groups in both ends of the spectrum, as it were. And we have exposed through our journalism, and other journalistic colleagues have exposed over the years, over and over and over again, connections between low-level politicians in the Sweden Democrats, local politicians, local sympathizers or party workers or party officials are, have been revealed to have connections to more violent and extreme groups. Now, sometimes this is because the most extreme groups want to sort of infiltrate the party, but sometimes there is no plan like this or project to infiltrate. It's a spontaneous overlap, a spontaneous connection. And the reason that this keeps happening is really quite obvious when you think about it, because yes, they have very different views about which methods to use, how to get there. But they do share the same vision, the vision of a homogeneous, pure nation that is cleaned and purified of minorities and alien elements and so on, a hierarchical society, an anti-egalitarian society where minorities are either eliminated or at least put in their place. They have this same far-right vision. So for most of the people interested in this ideology, they will look at these different parties and groups and say, well, the Sweden Democrats are good for maybe getting laws done and legislation, and the Nordic Resistance Movement is good for, keeping the streets secure from, foreign scum or whatever. So you'll often find these overlaps, even though maybe the group leaderships won't like each other and consider each other rivals. I mean, there are perspectives in political science or in sociology where you talk about social movement, like in social movement studies, where you talk about movements that have a common goal and move in the same direction, but some parts of the movement are radical and some are moderate and some are pragmatic. And if we compare this, for example, to the left-wing movement, which is perhaps more familiar to us, if we look at the history of the left-wing movement, we see all kinds of groups that were considered each other rivals and denounce each other, but they have very similar overall aims. They might have a sort of division of labor in terms of trying to shift politics in a certain direction. So we see that kind of complicated relationship all the time. Now, the question of weapons, I think that there is a risk there. I think that even the strongest supporters in the European establishment, in the European Union, who do want to keep sending weapons to Ukraine, who favor that type of policy, I'm talking about European Union counterterrorism officials, for example. Even while they have that policy, they recognize that in the long term, this does create the risk of situations where weapons do end up in the hands of extremist groups. So I think that is a risk. Although it should be said that even before the current escalation in the war in the Ukraine, there was a lot of weapons in circulation in Central and Eastern Europe that, according to some researchers, you can trace weapons moving from Eastern Europe and finding their ways into the hands of French right-wing extremists. So we've been seeing a worrying circulation of weapons already. Then, of course, we're also seeing another worrying tendency, which is the tendency of small-scale right-wing extremist actors making their own weapons through 3D printing, which is something that we're seeing more and more. So there are a lot of security risks when it comes to guns and the extreme right. And I might add, just to close that point, that we were talking earlier about this plot that was recently uncovered and stopped in Germany, where we see that when right-wing extremist groups are no longer so contained by counterterrorism or by police work or by popular anti-fascism, when they are no longer contained to the point where they have to act through lone acting extremists or small cells, when they're able to expand and create these very much larger networks like the network that we saw in Germany, then they're able to make use of weapons on a larger scale. It becomes an issue if they're able to get their hands on and get access to larger quantities of weapons that might not have been an issue before, when right-wing extremism was very, very strongly contained and had much more limited operational capacity. But when we're seeing very large networks like this with complex plans where they have members and sympathizers in different regions of a country, then it's particularly worrying when they have the chance to get their hands on a lot of weapons and explosives.
En la organización desarticulada recientemente en Alemania, lo que llamaba mucho la atención era la implicación de varios militares y varios miembros de las fuerzas y cuerpos de seguridad del Estado alemán. Aquí en España también se han denunciado en numerosas ocasiones algunas exhibiciones de la ideología de ultraderecha por parte de miembros tanto de las fuerzas y cuerpos de seguridad del Estado como de las Fuerzas Armadas. Sin embargo, tampoco es que se haya tomado demasiado en serio. ¿Pasa algo parecido en Suecia o en los países escandinavos, de acuerdo con las investigaciones que habéis realizado?
So to answer your question, in Scandinavia generally, and in Sweden in particular, we have not yet seen as large a problem as, for example, in Germany, of infiltration or the appearance of far-right sympathies in the uniformed services or in the military. However, we know, because they speak about it, that the Swedish far-right and the Nordic far-right in general want to infiltrate the armed services if possible. There's a part of the Swedish military that's called the Home Guard, I believe, which is a kind of volunteer type of paramilitary or military organization that's a little bit easier for people to join because it's a volunteer force. And we know that Swedish right-wing extremists have talked about systematically and strategically joining those parts of the military services that are easier to volunteer in. But this is a risk for the future, especially now with times of war in Europe. The Swedish military apparatus will probably see an expansion in the next few years. They will want to recruit a lot more new soldiers and personnel for the armed forces. And this will be a real risk that the Swedish security services will have to keep an eye on. And I wish I could say that I was confident in the ability of the Swedish security services to be effective and vigilant in this issue. But unfortunately, I think there's an opportunity for the right-wing extremists to exploit in that regard. But so far, we haven't seen very many cases of that. Just a handful of cases of soldiers who have clearly either left the armed services or continued in the armed services and have had right-wing extremist sympathies.
Durante muchos años, hablar de antifascismo para los medios de comunicación era hablar prácticamente de tribus urbanas. No ha sido considerado el antifascismo como esa vacuna democrática, como esa defensa radical de los derechos humanos que durante décadas pues había sido el antifascismo, ¿no? Esta situación lamentablemente se ha alargado durante demasiados años y hoy, sin embargo, ante esta emergencia y esta directa apelación que nos hace la extrema derecha, ganando cada vez más terreno, el antifascismo está empezando ya a ser una cuestión de autodefensa democrática, ¿no? Y yo creo que es una situación que estamos compartiendo en varios países de nuestro entorno que no sé tampoco esta situación si se ha dado en Suecia y en los países escandinavos, también teniendo en cuenta que vuestra revista, que vuestro trabajo en Expo, pues nunca habéis escondido que os llamáis antifascistas, os consideráis antifascistas.
Well, I think the situation in Sweden is similar to what you describe in Spain, that even here, the term anti-fascist has become, associated with violent left-wing extremism or with violent methods in general, or the so-called Antifa movement. However, I don't know if it's has gone as far as it has in the discourse in Spain, but anti-fascism is a charged term here as well. It's a sensitive term. Many people who work against the far right, for human rights, for democracy, prefer not to call themselves anti-fascist because it is sensitive, and they might call themselves anti-racist instead, which is seen as a safer term. However, I think it's important not to surrender or give up the term anti-fascism, because it really is about a broad movement. It has always represented a plurality of different ways of counteracting the extreme right and the far right. Of course, anti-fascism has had and still has violent practitioners as well. I mean, if we go back to the Second World War, that was obviously a violent conflict against fascism. But going back to the 1930s and 1920s, there's always been a wide variety of approaches to dealing with this problem. I mean, Sophie Scholl, this young, Christian student in Germany who resisted the Nazis, was an anti-fascist. The Expo Foundation is anti-fascist, and other people, are constantly thinking about ways and talking about how best to practice anti-fascism. So I think it's important and valuable to defend that term and to not be ashamed of it. But that said, yes, I mean, it is similar here that the term has become sensitive, but really it's when you think about it, it's opposition to fascism. It should not be controversial within democracy. It should not be controversial from a liberal perspective or a conservative perspective or a leftist perspective. So, yeah.
En España seguimos preguntándonos cuáles son las vías y los métodos más efectivos para frenar el auge de la ultraderecha. En La Marea hemos entrevistado a numerosos expertos, hemos dedicado revistas, los dosieres de entrevistas a preguntar a diferentes periodistas y especialistas en derechos humanos cómo frenar este auge y qué es lo mejor, si es desmantelar cuáles son sus vías de financiación, si es poner al descubierto la falsedad de sus discursos, si es mejor silenciar algunas de sus declaraciones, y seguimos sin tener clara cuál es la mejor estrategia. En el caso de Expo, que lleváis casi 30 años realizando estas labores de investigación, de charlas en colegios, en ONGs con grupos políticos y también monitorizando los grupos de ultraderecha, ¿cuáles creéis que son las vías más eficaces para frenar a la ultraderecha, tanto política como la más violenta de los grupos terroristas?
Thank you for that important question. Unfortunately, obviously, in Sweden and elsewhere, we haven't been able to stop the far right. But yes, we can see that some methods are perhaps more effective than others and more important than others. The first thing I think is that it's crucial that any analysis and any effort to counteract the far right take into account and take as its starting point the fact that it is a transnational movement that is, as I mentioned before, it's very similar across borders. And it is a movement that they love to, meet each other, share ideas, go on each other's shows and podcasts, learn from each other. They really interact in so many ways across borders. And this makes them a resilient movement, a smarter movement, a more dangerous threat to democracy. And the work of counteracting this movement has to be transnational as well. We have to do the kind of thing that we're doing now, sharing experiences, discussing methods, cooperating, collaborating across borders, because that's the only way that we're going to counter this threat. Another thing that I think is important is building bridges and building coalitions against the far right, even with groups that you might not agree with everything they say, or they might have a different ideological opinion. But it's very important that anti-fascism and anti-racism does not become isolated to a particular sector of the left or of the middle. It has to be a broad movement that has to involve institutions as well as grassroots, and it also ideally has to involve public agencies and security agencies, which have to be pressured, through politicians, through journalism, through public opinion work, to act against the far right. So I think, yes, recognizing the transnational character of the threat and the problem, and trying to find solutions that are also transnational, and also collaborating across as many sectors as possible of society. Those are some of the important things. And also, of course, which is the core idea of the Expo Foundation and magazine, is to spread knowledge and awareness about how these groups think and how they work. Many other groups in Sweden, and I think across the Western world, have a focus on the particular material conditions and the material parameters of these groups. And we do that as well. That's very important, obviously. But we also have to understand their ideas. We have to understand their discourses, their ideology. And it's from a democratic point of view, from a point of view of people who believe in human rights and equality and democracy, these ideas are, they can seem alien, they can seem, repellent, difficult for us to grasp. But it's really important for us to understand their ideology, because that's how they reach out to each other, how they recruit others. It's when we study their thinking and their ideology, it tells us what they're going to do next, how they're going to respond to a given situation, and so on. So understanding their ideas and really studying and researching their ideas is an important part of this work that also must not be neglected.
Pues hasta aquí nuestra entrevista de hoy, Morgan. Muchísimas gracias por tu tiempo. Reconocemos y admiramos todo el trabajo que hacéis desde Expo, y ha sido un placer conversar, tejer esos puentes tan necesarios, como bien decías, entre diferentes países, diferentes realidades, para combatir un problema común, que es esta extrema derecha y este intento por revertir los derechos humanos y la propia democracia, ¿no? Por lo tanto, esperemos volver a hablar pronto. Ha sido un placer conversar contigo y esperamos encontrarnos una vez más. Muchísimas gracias de parte de la Marea.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Morgan, porque efectivamente, como ha dicho Miquel, para la Marea, Expo es un referente muy inspirador, y esperamos que volvamos a poder colaborar, porque efectivamente esto es un trabajo transnacional. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, Morgan.
Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I wish you good luck in your continued work. And I hope that everyone watches feels that they can, everyone can contribute in some way to anti-racist work and anti-fascist work. And we all have to be very vigilant, and we cannot take democracy for granted, unfortunately, anymore.